What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Giovanni, and in today's video we're going to be going over frame rates. What frame rate should you guys be using? 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, and so on. In this video I'm going to be showing you guys and breaking down what settings to apply to your camera and what settings to apply before editing to make better content. So let's dive into it. We're going to be breaking things down. So frames per second, I'm pretty sure you've seen it whenever you're adjusting your settings in your camera or you're entering frames per second in your desired editing software for your timeline. So frames per second are frames that are taken by your camera per second. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, it takes 24 images to create 1 second video. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, it takes 30 images to make 1 second video. So now if anybody asks you, hey, what are frames per second? You know what to tell them, right? Gotcha. Depending where you live in the world, you'll select NTSC or PAL. I live in the US, so I'll select NTSC or 23.976. If you live outside the US, you'll select PAL, which is equivalent to 25 frames per second. Also, if you live in Central America or parts of South America, except for Brazil and French Guiana, you will use NTSC as well. And these are the settings that best work for me. So here you see that I have 2 different options, and I do select 23.98 versus 29.97. Why? Because 23.98 gives me more of a cinematic look. Also, the most motion blur, the better. Yes, 30 frames per second will give you smoother footage, but if you want that cinematic look, go for 24 frames per second. Now I'll have the option to shoot at 24 frames per second. So just check your camera set. Also, if you're shooting at 30 frames per second, your shutter speed should be at 1/60th of a second. If you're shooting 60 frames per second, your shutter speed should be at 1/20th of a second. Remember, your shutter speed should be double your frame rate. Remember that. For example, here I am using 24 frames per second and my shutter speed is double my frame rate. As you can see, I'm getting the most motion blur as possible. Now I'm using 30 frames per second and my shutter speed is double, which is 1/60th of a second. As you can see, there's a bit less motion blur. Now I switched over to 60 frames per second and my shutter speed is double. As you can see here, there's way less motion blur. If you're into photography, then you are familiar with the shutter speed and aperture. Shooting video, it's going to be a bit more difficult landing your exposure due to the shutter speed staying still. If there's more light coming into your camera, don't crank up the shutter speed. Otherwise, your footage will look like a scary movie, zombie movie, you name it. And if that's the look that you're going for, okay. But if you're not, remember the rule. The shutter speed should be double the frame rate. Before you press the record button, make sure you have applied the correct settings to your camera. Otherwise, when you drop your footage to your timeline and then export, nothing matches. That way, when you drop it at a 24 frames per second timeline and then export it at 24 frames per second, everything matches. If you have footage that you want to slow down like 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, or anything above that, don't just drop it to your timeline. There's other ways around it to get buttery slow-mo footage. If you guys are enjoying this video, give a video a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and let me know what you guys think about this video. I've created a sequence at 23.976. If you go to the settings, here you see that custom. You have the option 24 or 23.76. It's up to you, and these are my sequence settings. Also, you see that here I have 3 different frame rates. So what do we do now? Keep in mind that our timeline settings are at 23.976. So if we drop anything that is different to our timeline, it will modify the settings. For example, if we drop this footage to the timeline notice that the clip does not match the sequence settings. So what do you do here? Keep your existing settings. You don't want to change anything. Any footage that we drop after, we won't get that message anymore. So whenever you want to slow down your footage, don't just drop your footage to the timeline, modify it. So highlight everything that you want to slow down, modify, interpret footage, assume this frame rate, and type in 23.976 to match your sequence settings, and then it will round up automatically. The frame rate has been changed, and then when I drop the footage to the timeline, remember, keep existing settings. If your footage doesn't match your frame size, select, scroll down, go to set to frame size. So now when we play back our footage, look at the difference.